316. Study Session 2. Selected Approaches and Methodologies. Introduction. In this lecture, we'll examine the principles underlying the study of comparative politics. More specifically, our discussion will center more on what R.T. Suberu of 2004 described as intellectual foundation stones in this area of study. These, in other words, are supposed to be the building blocks upon which the whole structure is to be erected. Learning outcomes. At the end of this study session, it's expected that you'll be able to 1. Describe the intellectual history of political science in general, and in particular, the comparative area of study. 2. Identifying the main factors and forces which led to the development of some of the important approaches. And lastly, describe the basic ideas and issues that constitute the broad area of comparative politics. Generally speaking, in view of the long history of politics as well as its study, the comparative aspect of the field must equally have a long history. For instance, just as politics in general is often traced to the activities of such early philosophers as Plato and Aristotle, and the activities in Athens and other early Greek city-states, the Genesis comparative politics can also be linked with the efforts of Aristotle at collecting information about a large number of different constitutions for the purpose of comparison. Thus, it could be said that the approaches to comparative politics, just as in the mainstream politics, can be classified into the ancient and modern contemporary groups. In the first group, that is the ancient group, we have the normative philosophical approach and the descriptive institutional approach, both of which dominated the study of politics between 1900. While in the second group, that is the modern contemporary group, we have the behavioral approach, the normative philosophical approach. Traditionally, the study of politics was dominated by philosophical reflections on certain universal political values like equality, freedom, and justice. This is why the writings of such early philosophers as Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Hobbes, Niccolo Machiavelli, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, among several others, concentrated on these values that are regarded as essential to the just state and the good of the citizens. The normative philosophical approach is the oldest and least scientific approach to the study of mainstream politics as well as comparative politics. It has over the years been gradually overshadowed but not completely displaced by modern or more contemporary approaches. The descriptive institutional approach. This approach to the study of politics, and by extension, comparative politics, originally focused on the discussion of the evolution and operation of the legislature, executive, and judiciary, which are respectively the institutions for making, enforcing, and interpreting the law. However, over time, the list of institutions discussed came to include political parties, constitutions, bureaucracies, interest or pressure groups, and other associations that are more or less permanently engaged in politics. In the descriptive institutional approach, unlike in the normative philosophical approach, the emphasis is on facts rather than value. In other words, descriptive institutional approach seeks to provide factual and historical answers to such questions as: what are the historical sources of parliamentary supremacy? By what electoral arrangements are rulers of representative chosen? What are the relative merits and demerits of a system of government like the parliamentary over and above the presidential system of government, or vice versa? In what way can a flexible constitution be regarded as better in operation, or vice versa, than a rigid constitution? Although the descriptive institutional approach is fairly old, it is still very relevant as contemporary political scientists and researchers in general still devote substantial attention to the examination of major political institutions like the executive, the judiciary, the civil service, the legislature, and local governments. According to Rotimi Suberu, 2004, from this inquiry, valuable knowledge about the organization of political institutions can be acquired, proposals for their reform recommended, and general conclusions offered. The behavioral or scientific approach. It is important to note that the behavioral approach, which is also popularly regarded as a scientific approach, developed and was popularized in opposition to the normative and descriptive orientations of the older or traditional approaches to the study of politics. The behavioralists, that is, proponents of the behavioral approach, emphasize and concentrate on careful observation and examination of individual behavior in the political process, and subsequently use such examination to form opinions on a whole group or institutions. In fact, this can be likened to what the natural scientists do in the laboratories where and when they observe animals or even human beings in experiments for effective diagnosis and treatment or prevention of ailments. By doing so, the behavioral approach not only emphasizes facts over values, but also argues that it is the behavior of individuals in political institutions rather than the institutions themselves that is the essence of politics. The behavioralists therefore emphasize the use of scientific and empirical method in political research, and in fact believe that the political science could become as sophisticated and rigorous as the natural and physical science. Behavioralists also called for greater integration of political science with other social sciences, such as psychology, sociology, and economics, while they also made vigorous attempts to borrow from biology, physics, and some other aspects of the physical, mathematical, and natural sciences. Such borrowings, which are often related to certain principles of the behavioral approach, as identified and popularized by David Easton, a prominent American political scientist and behavioralist. For instance, emphasizes regularities, verification, techniques, and quantification. We will take more explanatory notes on these four principles that have, over the years, helped to sustain the focus of behavioralists on facts rather than value. But before then, we may need to briefly trace the beginning of the behavioral approach. According to Suberu in 2004, the beginning of the behavioral approach in political science may be traced to the publication in 1908 of Human Nature in Politics by Graham Wallace and The Process of Government by Arthur Bentley. Unlike previous works, both books focus on the behavioral and informal processes of political activity, rather than on philosophical postulations or governmental institutions. Wallace used a psychological approach to highlight the complex role of human nature in political conduct, while Bentley used a sociological approach to explain the new concept of groups in politics. With the end of the First World War in 1918, the behavioral revolution blossomed in the United States of America, which probably remains the only country where the behavioral approach is most fully developed. Charles Merriam and his student Harold Laswell were the two major intellectual giants of the behavioral approach. Around this time, they both introduced to the study of politics such new and scientifically systematic concepts as power and political elites. Between 1925 and the Second World War years, that is between 1937 to 1945, there was a relative decline in the popularity of behavioral approach. However, the approach witnessed a significant and tremendous revival after the war and dominated the study of politics throughout the 50s. The major behavioralists in that era included such notable intellectuals as David Easton, Robert Dahl, Carl Judge, Gabriel Almond, and David Truman, among others. This trend continued as the behavioral approach dominated the study of politics, particularly in the United States, until the late 1960s, when some behavioralists argued that the approach should be revised and refined to accommodate new developments in the world of politics. The revisionist argument was known as the post-behavioral movement and was spearheaded by David Easton. Now let us return to our discussion on the stages of regularities, verification, techniques, and quantification. In the behavioral or scientific approach, as promised earlier on, these four concepts are the first out of the 8 principles of the behavioral approach to the study of comparative politics. It is defined by David Easton. Each of these principles will now be discussed. Regularities. Behavioralists argue that there are certain underlying assumptions and conditions that govern the political behavior of individuals and which can be discovered through systematic study. In other words, the political behavior of individuals is not arbitrary but is governed by certain factors that can be examined and over time established as standards. For example, a group of individuals may continue to vote for the same party over a long period of time. Through behavioral approach, through behavioral research, we should be able to determine whether his voting behavior is related to their ideological orientation, socioeconomic status, or ethno-religious affiliations of the individual. Thus, the behavioralists argue that there are discoverable uniformities or regularities in political behavior, and that these can be expressed in systematic generalizations or theories with explanatory and predictive values. Subaru, 2004. Verification. Just as in the natural, physical, biological, or mathematical sciences, the behavioralists argue that the emphasis in the study of political science or comparative politics should be factual, empirical, and scientific. Therefore, they contend that all statements, generalizations, or theories about comparative politics must be based on factual observation and must be verifiable. This process of empirical verification or testing is quite important in assessing the validity, acceptability, or utility of any generalization or statement in political science. Techniques. Verification of statements and generalizations, as we discussed above, must be based on the use of reliable and sophisticated scientific techniques, including well-structured interview samples, survey samples, statistical management, including well-structured interviews, sample surveys, statistical measurements, and mathematical models. Quantification. The use of statistical and mathematical measurements can help to achieve adequate precision or accuracy in observing, recording, and analyzing research studies in political science. Therefore, there must be a shift in method from the qualitative judgment that dominated the normative philosophical approach to the quantitative measurement associated with the natural and physical sciences. However, this is not to say that the qualitative methods are no longer relevant. It should be noted that they are useful and relevant, particularly in view of specific objectives of research studies. In order to deepen our understanding of David Easton's contribution from his 8 principles of foundation stones to the behavioral approach, we need to list the 4 other principles. These are namely values, systematization, pure science, and integration. While values or ethical evaluations are a feature of the normative philosophical approach, which must be de-emphasized in any serious scientific research exercise, systematization simply refers that any research study in political science must be pursued not as an end in itself, but as a means to prove or disprove some statement or generalization. Pure science, as it is used by Easton, is just to say that greater importance should be attached to pure research, while integration depicts the efforts of the behavioralists at promoting the unity of the social sciences, namely political science, economics, psychology, sociology, and in many places, geography. It expresses the hope that someday the walls which separate political science from the other social sciences will crumble. Study session summary. The formal study of politics, that is political science, like most other areas of learning, can be easier when based on methods, methodologies, and approaches. In this session, we examine three important approaches. These are namely normative philosophical approach, which focuses more on the study of political values, the descriptive institutional approach, that is more concerned with the evolution and operations of such institutions as the legislature, executive, judiciary, and bureaucracy, and the behavioral or scientific approach, which focuses more on the study of individual political behavior. Quite importantly, students are encouraged to identify any of these approaches that catches their fancy as a preferable choice for the study of political events in Nigeria, and for the purpose of comparison between the country and other parts of the world. End of study session 2. Thank you for listening.